that's the pitfall, I would say, of being multilingual. Like, you need to keep up with all of the languages, and at some point life catches up. You can't do all of the things at the same time.
Bienvenidos a todos. Today I have another special guest that will be sharing their language learning journey. And can you share what is your name and where are you from?
Well, my name is Leontes Henriquez, on YouTube known as Mr. Henriquez, and I'm from the Netherlands.
And what is your native language?
Dutch.
Dutch. Okay, so that's what they speak in the Netherlands.
Yeah, we speak Dutch. Yeah.
Dutch. Okay. I don't know anything about Dutch, so
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
wow. Well, maybe the tulips and the windmills, wooden shoes, those stereotypical things.
Mhm.
Or maybe that we are very lenient with drugs, so you can literally just walk 5 minutes from my house and get weed if you want.
Wow. Okay, so can you share a little bit about learning English? Because of course you speak English as well.
Yeah, of course. I speak English because my mother is a native speaker of English. She's from Sint Maarten, which is an island in the Caribbean, and I've studied English at the university to be able to teach English at some point, which I'm doing now, teaching English at secondary school. I've worked at a teacher training program, so I used to teach people who wanted to become teachers of English. Um, and that's my what I do now, and how I've come to understand and speak English the way I do.
Okay, share a little bit about your bilingual experience then when you were growing up. Or I guess were you speaking any other languages in the household besides English and Dutch?
Well, my father is from Curaçao, which is another Dutch island in the Caribbean, and
Mm.
they speak Papiamento. So I was actually raised trilingually, with English and Papiamento being the first languages that I would learn, and then Dutch being my third language, actually. But
Wow.
has kind of merged into my native language now. So that was quite interesting. Now, in general, my parents used to speak Papiamento to us. My mother used to speak somewhat English. I think at some point they decided that they wanted to raise their children all speaking both Papiamento and speaking English. But for some reason, it became more natural for them to speak Papiamento. So as long as I can remember, my parents would speak Papiamento, and my mother would usually speak English at some issues, especially if I did something that deserved the punishment. She would go into her Virgin Island English, which is a variety of English that they speak on Sint Maarten. So, my entire name would be yelled out through the house, and I would know, okay, my mother is speaking English, so I'm in trouble.
And what is that language called again? I can't pronounce that properly.
Papiamento or
Papiamento.
Papiamentu. Yeah.
Papiamento. Okay, and what is there another language that is close to this one?
Well, it's a mix of Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and English. So I would say it looks more like Portuguese than Spanish, to be honest, but it has lots of Spanish traits. I'm learning Spanish as well because my father is from Curacao and his family is from Venezuela. So I think, well, I need to speak Spanish as well. And it's not that I can do lots of those Spanish things easier because I speak Papiamento. I think when I was learning French in secondary school, I had more. The speaking Papiamento was more of a benefit to me than it is now with the Spanish for some reason.
That sounds like a very unique upbringing and also very
Yeah,
confusing. Very
yeah,
confusing. Was it confusing
yeah.
for you or was it, I mean, of course it was more likely normal, right?
Yeah, it was normal. And my parents are real boomers. No, they're not boomers. They're Gen X, which is kind of the generation that comes after boomers. And so they were raised in the 80s, young in the 90s. And they were from the generation where people would say the old school thought that you should not teach children several languages at the same time because then they would get confused. So
Wow.
when we started to go to school, my teachers in primary school would say, "Well, don't teach them another language than Dutch because they now have to go to school. They have to use Dutch." And my parents, of course, refused to do this because they thought that makes no sense. We were raised bilingually. My mother was raised speaking Dutch, English, and French, so trilingually. My father was raised speaking Spanish and Papiamento, and of course Dutch when he was at school, so also trilingually. So the entire idea of not using another language when around a child makes no sense, of course. And it is something that has disappeared now. In our primary schools, they teach children Dutch, English, and at some schools even French. So they try to play with lots of languages, but it wasn't confusing for me though. So even though that my teachers would say that it was confusing for us, I wouldn't think it's particularly confusing. I do know that there are many things that I simply don't know the Dutch word of, especially when I was young. And those are things that usually are are kind of related to the culture in which you grow up. So particular dishes that would have a Dutch word or Dutch name, I would know because I would use the Papiamento equivalent, or simply do not I wouldn't encounter that dish in my household when I was young. So that's interesting. I also noticed that my Dutch is not, even though I'm quite fluent in Dutch. I noticed that I haven't studied in Dutch. Right, I did my university degree in English. All my
Okay.
5 years at university were in English.
Or in English.
So
Wow.
yeah, so I would say my English is better than my Dutch at this point. I know all of the English grammar rules, or all of them. I know most of them, of course, and I don't know most of the Dutch grammar rules. That's the pitfall, I would say, of being multilingual. That you need to keep up with all of the languages, and at some point, life catches up. You can't do all of the things at the same time.
And then you also said you were learning French, right?
Yeah, in secondary school.
In secondary school. Okay, how was that experience?
Well, we Dutch children have to learn several languages at school. So they have to do Dutch, of course. They have to do English, and they have to do French and German. And at some point, you can choose whether you want to move on studying German or studying French. I chose to study French, and I had this teacher who was rather old school, but not really old school. So she was really old school in the sense of she would explain all the grammar rules, and we would do lots of grammar things. But then she was kind of progressive because she would only speak French in class. And now that I'm teaching English myself, I kind of came to respect what she was doing back then, because I thought, well, lots of things that I can do now in French are because she would used to speak French. She used to speak French in class. So ouvrir la fenêtre, open the window, is something that she would say all the time. Asseyez-vous, sit down. Fermez la porte, close the door. Those are things that are just ingrained in my mind of all of the French lessons that I had.
Okay.
So it was quite fun, actually.
And are you still keeping up with your French?
I'm not keeping up with it, but I haven't forgotten about my French. If I listen or read something in French and I take my time, I am able to understand quite a lot. I wouldn't say that I'm very fluent at French anymore, but I can maybe order a coffee somewhere without lots of hesitation.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, I'm from the language learning school that says language learning requires exposure and interaction. So if I don't have those things, I find it very difficult to keep up with my language.
And have there been any other languages that you have learned?
So I started learning Spanish because I think that's good for my heritage. Being from Venezuela, so at least my family is from Venezuela, so I need to speak a bit of Spanish as well. I started learning Arabic at some point to impress a girl, but then yeah, I stopped because that's impossible. And that's basically it. Yeah,
Yeah, I've heard Arabic is very, very difficult to learn.
it has a different way of writing. So different symbols, different structure. You write from left to right instead of right to left. No, wait. You write from
Right to left, right?
right to left. Yeah,
Opposite,
yeah.
yeah.
The opposite. Yeah.
Yeah,
So that's
that's different.
difficult.
And okay, growing up, so with Spanish, were you able to understand it very well and speak it, I guess?
I don't know about when I was growing up, but I noticed that there are some things that I can understand when my family from Latin America would speak Spanish. So there are a few things that I can simply understand because they resemble what it sounds like in Papiamento. And being a language person, I'm able to connect everything that I don't know. So then I would kind of guess what it's about. But I noticed that as soon as I started watching Spanish television, so I watched La Venganza de las Juanas or something, a Netflix series about lots of people named Juana, and I was unable to understand what they were saying without the subtitles. And now when I'm doing Duolingo with Spanish, I understand a few things. I understand a lot. Most of the things I understand the basics, but then when they bring a new word in, if it doesn't resemble anything that I already know, I find it very difficult to understand and memorize the word. So I'd say that I would understand a few things, but then I would say European at Cepher level, A2, maybe A1, A2-ish. That would be the max that I would be able to do in Spanish.
Okay, so you said you're learning with Duolingo, right? So
Yeah.
Duolingo, Netflix, what else are you using to learn?
Well, what I wanted to do was that I wanted to read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory in Spanish. I have some of my students who are on the lower side of their English skills, they have to read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and we read it together. So they come to class, and then I have an audio book on YouTube, and that kind of and then they read along and underline all the words. And then I thought I should do the same with Spanish, because I always recommend people to use stories that they're familiar with when they're trying to learn a new language. Then I thought I should do the same with my Spanish. Simply get the book and read along and see how many words I already know. And next to doing the Duolingo and maybe watching stuff on Netflix.
So do
Yeah.
you think language learning applications are very helpful? I know this is a very controversial topic.
Well, I've used Duolingo for about 120 days now, and
Good streak.
yeah, yeah. Well, I missed 2 days this week, so
Ah.
I'm not too proud. But I think it has a lot of benefits. What I really like about Duolingo is that it presents a new word in a particular context. It's so easy to guess what the word is that they're trying to learn you or trying to teach you, that you're trying to learn. And then they use it several times throughout the exercise. So you encounter the word several times in a different context. I think that's very good. I think language learning wise and what they do and how they present new words, I think that's good. I don't think that you can really be um, a very fluent speaker using Duolingo, especially the free version.
Mhm.
I think it requires more. You need to interact with people. You need to have a lot of exposure. And doing Duolingo for a few times a day will not make you a native speaker or a near native speaker of any language. But it's a very good place to start. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I always very surprised how simple it is for me to memorize new words. I'm using it right now for French. I'm just like, yeah, I've learned a lot of like new words and new phrases from Duolingo. So I'm very impressed,
Yeah,
very happy, and it's free.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's free. Yeah.
Okay. So what is your definition of fluency since you mentioned that?
Well, that's a good question. I hope none of my students are watching because they might say, "Yeah, but you said." Well, I can actually bring it home with some things about my teaching. So when I'm marking speaking exams, I always try to understand the context in which students are learning the language. So what we're doing is we're teaching children, Dutch children, that they need to learn the language to communicate with other people who are not native speakers of Dutch. So the idea that they will speak to someone who is an English native speaker is outdated and sort of archaic. So we're not using that idea anymore. At least I'm not using that idea anymore, because I think that they need to be able to communicate with people who are not native speakers of Dutch. Now, when I'm marking their fluency, I have this thing that I call looking for language. And then if I would give them, if they would fail the test, I would usually say, you don't have the language to communicate. And I would say that someone is fluent when they have the language to communicate the ideas that they want to communicate. So what Dutch children usually do when they're in a speaking exam, they would assume things. So then they would not know a particular word, or they would not know how to say something. And then they would assume that I would know what it is. So they go like, well, you know that. So then instead of being a good conversational partner, I'm still the examiner. So I would go like, no, I don't know what you're talking about, even though I know what they might be talking about, which is something that I try to switch off because I'm marking their fluency.
Mhm.
So instead of making full sentences with nice subjects and verbs and lots of other things that you need in a good sentence, they would leave stuff out because they don't have the language to communicate their ideas. So I would say that someone is fluent when they're able to communicate their ideas properly. And it can be at a lower level. So when you're a beginner, you have a different level of fluency. So you would discuss stuff that is closely related to you, like your family, your hobbies, and things that you like. And if you become more advanced, you will be able to talk about things that are kind of further away from you. So and if you do that, you're very fluent, and automatically you will be able to talk about stuff that's related to your own world more easier as well. Easier as well. Yeah.
I guess how important is pronunciation, accents, and then also mistakes when it comes to fluency, with your definition of fluency?
Well, I think the benchmark that I would use is, are you intelligible? So now I know that, for example, Americans, you guys only learn one language, maybe two languages in school, right?
Correct.
And some people in America find it very difficult to talk to people who make lots of mistakes because they simply don't understand.
Yep.
Whereas we are kind of multilingual here. So, we accept that people make mistakes. So in my definition, I would say that accent and making mistakes is part of natural language. Native speakers make mistakes as well. But as long as you're intelligible, so your idea comes across properly, and doesn't lead to misunderstandings, I think there's no problem with making mistakes and mispronouncing things. I know that Dutch people have the tendency to make fun of everyone who has a Dutch accent. So when someone is speaking English, like our prime minister, for example, or the coach Louis van Gaal, or Erik ten Hag, who is now manager of Man United, Dutch people tend to make fun of people's accent because, you know, you sound like a Dutch person. You speak Dunglish. Whereas I would say, well, you might be speaking Dunglish, you might have this very large, very thick accent, but if you're able to communicate your ideas properly, if you're fluent, I think that's more important than being 100% correct when it comes to pronunciation.
So are there many different accents there in the Netherlands?
Well, every region has their own sort of variety or dialect of Dutch. We have one standard, which is called Algemeen Beschaafd Nederlands, ABN, kind of general accepted Dutch. And it's kind of funny that people from the north, which is where I live, they tend to speak, if they don't have the dialect that we speak here, they tend to speak more this general Dutch thing than people from The Hague, people from Amsterdam, people from Rotterdam, so kind of the main popular areas of the Netherlands. So we tend to speak with a softer version of Dutch, which is generally accepted, whereas people from Amsterdam and the West, as we call it, would speak with a harder, I would say, a more accentuated version of Dutch. Yeah.
So why would it not be, or why would your accent in the North be more accepted than the accents of the South?
Well, I don't know whether it's more accepted. I think it's more that people are well, people who come from the western part of the country and move up north, they would say, well, you speak differently than we do. And for some reason, people find that people from the north speak this more what we would call standard version of Dutch, even though that we've got lots of accents and dialects here as well.
Okay.
So I think it sounds more natural. I don't know. It sounds softer, more pleasant to hear.
More pleasant. What is your opinion? Which accent or dialect of Dutch is the best?
I would say ours. Yeah, I don't know. I think it you know, people who are on television have their own. Those are the people that we hear the most. People on television, news presenters, and
Okay.
people who work with the news are usually the ones that we would use as benchmark. So I would say that those are the ones that I would rate highest.
And do you find it challenging to develop an accent in a language?
Yeah, I think so. Especially with English, because I know that everyone is focused on the way I would speak English, even on YouTube. When Dutch children come into my exam training sessions, I know that some of them are going to be like, he mispronounces this. He says this differently. Whereas I would say, well, it doesn't really matter because I'm not a native speaker of English.
Okay.
So even though I try to fake it until I make it, I'm never going to be a native speaker of English because I'm not in that environment. If I would move to the UK, then I might become more like a native speaker than I am here in the Netherlands because, yeah, I'm simply not exposed to English enough to really develop a near native English accent. So yeah, I find it quite hard actually. Yeah.
So exposure is key then,
Yeah,
in your
definitely.
opinion, exposure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And how about for your students? Have you found it very challenging for them to develop an accent as well?
Well, to be honest, I think it's more the fluency part that they struggle with the most. We cannot really get to the accent part because we're still struggling with the fluency part.
I
The
see.
problem with Dutch education is that people really think everything we do is linear. So I need to learn something tomorrow that I didn't know today, and the day after that, I need to learn something more difficult than the day before. Whereas language learning is never linear. You never learn a language in a linear way. You need to have the exposure to the language. You need to be doing stuff with the language that you learn, both the language that you are learning and the language that you learn in class. And if we don't have the fluency to do what we want to do, we can't really have the focus on accents and say, well, what do you want to become? What kind of English do you want to speak? And most Dutch children actually speak American English or a variety of American English because
Okay.
of all the exposure that we have to American English.
Okay, yeah, that was gonna be my next question, about like the American accent specifically, because I know there's like a big craze around the world, I suppose. Everybody wants to speak like an American. Like I've seen it so many times on even like in, YouTube videos from English teachers, how to speak like, an American, how to speak with an American accent. So I guess that's very popular there, right, as well in the
Yeah,
Netherlands.
yeah, and mostly because of what happened with Netflix and all the television series that we watch here. Everything is Americanized.
Wow.
Um, and that's interesting because our the books that we use in school would usually use British English as their standard. So then you would have lots of Dutch kids who play games, who watch American television. Then they go to school and they have a teacher, and the teacher says, "We're now going to do something extremely British, and we're going to watch a video from people from London." Whereas I would say, well, these are not people that that's not people that they're familiar with. So on the tests, they would do British English with British speakers with a thick accent, and then all of the kids would be confused because this is not the English that I know. And then even the English that would be on the test would be a variety of English that is standardized, right? So it's
Mhm.
kind of the Queen's or the King's English in an extreme form because they're actors. And then when they go to a place like Manchester or Liverpool, they would realize that even that was not the English that's really spoken because those were actors. So that's very funny to see. That even in all of the books that we have, we're never going to have the real American and real English accents that we want because they're actors and they
Yep.
try their best to speak and pronounce things as clearly as possible. How do you think about what do you experience with learning Spanish? Do you have the standard accent that you're learning, or are you learning something from different regions?
So in the beginning of my journey, I was just trying to kind of like what you said, just trying to stay afloat. I was just trying to get to like a fluency level, trying to learn vocabulary, phrases, trying to understand, Spanish grammar. So I wasn't really focused on accents. I couldn't even tell you the difference between, different accents in different Spanish speaking countries. So that was completely just, out of the window. That wasn't my focus. But it has changed a little bit now because now, actually, no, a lot because now I love to try to imitate accents. It's like one aspect of language learning that I just love. I'm very passionate about. So I think it started once I went to the Dominican Republic a few years ago. I started to fall in love with the Dominican culture. Then I'm like, oh, their accent is, really cool, but it's also very different. So for me, it was like a big culture shock moment because then I realized that kind of like the Spanish I was more used to didn't sound anything like Dominican Spanish. So it was just like, wow, like there's a whole nother world out there. So then I just started to study a lot more about, just accents there, than accents in other countries as well.
Well, I had the same when I'm familiar with Latin American Spanish. So at some point, I was watching television and something from Spain was on television, and I was unable to understand what they were saying because Spanish from Spain is so different from Spanish from Latin America. That was like, whoa, this is a completely new language that I'm learning here.
Yeah, for me, it's always surprising just how different they are because it's not like there's a little bit difference, right, in between the accents and the dialects. They're like different languages, kind of like you said.
Yep. Yeah. Which you also see in the UK because, as I said, we're familiar with standard English, sort of London, Southern London English, that kind of variety. But then if you go to the real places and you talk to the real people of the UK, you'll notice that there are so many different varieties of English within the British Isles that it's impossible to learn all of them and understand everything. When I went to
Mhm.
Manchester to study a few years ago, on my first day, I thought I'd been studying English for about 10 years now, but I wasn't able to understand the people in Manchester at the till because who are they?
Wow.
What are you saying? I was not familiar with the way they spoke, so that was very difficult and an eye opener to realize that even though I thought I was fluent, I'm not that fluent in Manchester English.
Mhm. Yeah, that's something that I'm starting to learn more about because I'm not very familiar with Europe at all and all the different accents that they have there, English accents. So I started to see a lot more videos pop up, like like on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube that show the differences and how different people speak over there. I'm just like, wow, yeah, I don't understand that at
Yeah,
all. And I'm a native English speaker, so for me,
yeah.
it definitely makes me laugh.
Have you encountered all of the accents in America?
Yeah, in America, I'll say yes, I have.
Okay.
And even yeah, here it's pretty different too. I mean, I grew up in the north, and if I go, I'm right now I live in Texas, but if I were to like just move down here from the north, people will know that yeah, you're not from here. The same thing if
Yeah, yeah,
someone
yeah.
from the south goes up to the north, it's like yeah, you're not from here. I could tell. So even the
Yeah,
accents
yeah.
here are pretty, they're pretty distinct as well. And do you think it's important to travel to learn a new language?
I think it is. Yeah, I think traveling and speaking to those of the language that you're learning, I think that's very important. There's this debate whether language and culture are linked. Some people say that language and culture are linked a lot. Others might say that language and culture are not linked, especially now with the idea of English as a lingua franca, which is the English people speak who are not native speakers of English. Who owns English is basically the question. Which culture owns English? Some
Question.
people might say it's the British Isles who own English because they founded English, whereas others might say no, America owns English because they spread English around the world with their television stuff. Whereas others might say no, we as let's say Sint Maarten, we have our own variety of English and we own that part of English. So if you're learning a language, I think encountering different cultures is part of it. Get to feel that culture as well. So yes, I would definitely say that traveling is part of learning a language. Definitely.
Okay, let's answer this question then. Do you think language is linked to culture?
I think for some languages it is. Like French is definitely linked to French culture, and that's also because the way that France would kind of set up their empire, sort of. You know that every country that they colonized was French. Full stop. There was no discussion. I think with English and the overseas territories, it's different because they had more freedom when compared to I think the French colonies. Don't quote me on this. I don't know. In that case, I'd say for English that all the varieties have their own culture and they show that culture through the language that they use. So yes, I would say language and culture are linked.
What would be your piece of advice for a new language learner to learn, their target language through culture? How should they go about that?
Well, I'd say do the basics, the exposure and interaction, and rely on your first language as well. Even though I would say full immersion is best. If you're older and you have some knowledge of language, you can definitely rely on languages that you know. And I think it's good to have a basis that is the same for all of the language for the language that you're learning. So if you're learning Spanish, I would say it would good to have the basic Spanish that is understandable, the shared core of Spanish understandable for all of the Spanish speakers. But if you choose to focus on a particular culture that you like, that you enjoy, a country that you like, yeah, dive into that culture. Dive into the differences between that culture and Spanish and Spain, for example. Or in our case, dive into that culture and the differences with English, whether it's American English or British English. Or even a variety of English within America or the UK might be quite interesting to study based on the culture that is part of that language. So if you study Liverpoolian English, you need to talk about the docks, you need to talk about the Labour Party, you need to talk about the unions, about the 90s with Thatcher, to really understand why these people speak the way they speak, I think. I would say so.
And on the same note, how would you learn a language from scratch? Like if you had to, learn a new language starting today.
I start with some nouns and definitely vocabulary. I'd say vocabulary is the most important thing that you need to learn if you're starting from scratch. Start with things that you know, so things that are around you. So you and your life, you and your siblings, you and your family, and find something that is within your so-called zone of proximal development. Are you familiar with zone of proximal development?
I'm not familiar with that.
So the zone of proximal development is the idea that you have something that you understand, and then you have something that's way too difficult for you to do. So you need a lot of help, and it would be too challenging to do. And the space between what you know and what's too difficult is called the zone of proximal development. And what you want to do is when you're learning a language is make sure that you're learning stuff within that zone of proximal development. And sometimes some things might be too difficult because they're at the upper edge of your zone of proximal development. And sometimes something might be too easy because it's way too close to what you already know. And if you're learning a language from scratch, you definitely need to find a spot within your zone of proximal development that you feel comfortable with. And I also think that it's important when you're learning a language from scratch that you think of how can I translate phrases and words into my own language and use that as a guide. I would definitely not focus on grammar, which is something that I like about Duolingo, where they do grammar, but they do they don't explain grammatical rules unless it's absolutely necessary. So I was learning Japanese with my girlfriend on Duolingo as well. And because it's a different language that is completely different from the language that we know, they did explain some grammar rules, that there were certain sounds and suffixes and affixes that they would add to words to change the thing, and then it would make a comparison between English and Japanese. But if you're not doing anything that particularly interesting, like Japanese, which is a completely different language, I'd say, leave the grammar out for as long as possible and try to learn the language and the rules by looking at the context in which something appears, by looking at texts, and by learning through the immersion technique, basically.
Wow. Okay. That's also another controversial topic right there, grammar.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I assume in your classrooms, of course, or in your classes, you are teaching, grammar and such, right?
Not that much, actually.
Really?
Yeah. I try to not teach grammar, and I try to teach grammar either using a flipped classroom technique or by doing it inductively or deductively, so that the students kind of need to figure it out. And I noticed that for some students, it doesn't work that way because they want to do it grammatically, right? They want to do the grammar rules, they want to do the grammar tests. But if you don't have a grammar test, it makes no sense to teach you the grammar because you need to produce language. So it makes more sense to teach you phrases and chunks and things that you can use instead of a grammar rule that you're probably going to forget. For some reason, all the Dutch classes start with teaching tenses. So all of the kids need to learn all the tenses, English tenses, but then they know all the rules and they know what the tenses are, and then they forget about it and they need to learn it again and they forget about it because it's so unnatural to learn about tenses in a language that you don't even master fully. Or for some students, they learn about tenses, but then their language is already so good that they naturally do stuff. So they are very fluent, albeit with some incorrect tenses once in a while, but they are very fluent. So using the tenses and learning about the tenses would not make sense because then we're forcing them into a particular mindset by having them do fill in the gap exercises on tests.
Yeah, I didn't like those at all when I was in high school and or in college as well. I didn't like that. Those weren't fun. Like the grammar worksheets, I never liked that. Never. That was not my preferred, method for learning Spanish. Not at all. They were very boring.
And I think grammar has its place in the classroom. When you talk about writing, for example, I did a few classes on sentence structure, where I talked about the subject, the verbs, and the object, and sentence analysis. Why? Because I noticed that students were struggling making full sentences. So then looking back at the language, stepping back and looking at it from a different perspective and saying, well, which parts do we have in this sentence gives me the vocabulary and them the vocabulary that they can talk about sentence structure and understand how to make good sentences. But I'm not going to quiz them by saying, give me all the subjects in these sentences. No, I want to see that they can make sentences with subject, verbs, and objects. And when I notice that they miss something, I'd say, do you remember we talked about subject, verb, object? And then some of them would go, yeah, I remember. Look at your own writing and try to do that as well by using the same structure, subject, verb, object.
And what is the age range of your students?
12 to 18.
Have you taught outside of that age range?
Yeah, I did. When I was teaching at the teacher training program, I had students from 18 to 55 or something. There were adults who switched careers and wanted to become English teachers, so they were part of my teaching as well.
Did you find that these different age ranges learned English at a different pace, or they found it, more difficult?
Well, I would say that the adults found it more difficult because their language is already quite fossilized. Mm-hmm. They speak Dutch or they speak some sort of English variety, or they do just a little bit of English once in a while. And then they need to learn to become fluent English teachers. And I noticed that they would rely more on grammar and their first language than, let's say, 18, 19-year-olds. They would go with the flow more, the younger people. And the older people would definitely want to have some sort of structure, some sort of reference point in Dutch that they would say, this is this in Dutch, so then this would be in English the same. So yeah. So that's something that I definitely noticed.
Okay, and with the older students, right? What was their level of English when they first started?
It depends. Some already had quite high levels, so really near native, and others were, I would say that they would be able to understand English quite well, but their productive level was quite low, actually. So they would have, I think, B1 level or B2 level, and then they would need to get to C1, C2 at some point, which are the higher levels of the European framework. Whereas young people, of course, they live on TikTok, they live on Instagram, they live on Netflix, they play games. So even though they might make a lot of mistakes, they would still be more fluent than those who are a bit older and did not grow up with the TikTok and the Netflix.
And
Yeah.
you said that so the teachers, or to become, I guess, a teacher, they had to reach C1 or C2 level.
Yeah, for English they do, yeah.
Do students, or not, I guess not students, do language learners usually reach, C1 or, near native levels of their target
Yeah.
language?
Yeah, I think for English in the Netherlands, definitely they do. We are quite high when it
Mhm.
comes to our when we are ranked regarding our English level. I think we're third or something on the list, and I think Finland would be first, as always.
Okay.
No, I think that we are able to get them there because they have so much exposure to English. Dutch is not something that younger people, I wouldn't say enjoy a lot, particularly enjoy. It's more that when I do a raise of hands and I say, how many of you have Dutch TikToks on your TikTok? I think only 3 students would raise their hands, whereas others would, all of them would raise their hand when I ask them, do you have English TikToks on your TikToks? And everyone on your TikTok, and everyone, yeah, yeah, all of my TikToks are in English. So I
Wow.
think that's why we can get them at that level. And I've spoken to the people who make our final exams for English quite a few times, and they said, well, compared to 2015, our English grades, final grades, have gone up 1.2 points. So instead of where they would get a 6 in the past, that 6 is now a 7.2. So it's very difficult to differentiate and to properly test Dutch students' English levels because they are so good at it. So how do you test their levels when they all get 9s and 10s? Is the test still valid when everybody gets high grades?
That's a very good question. Never thought about that before.
Well, I think usually people would say it's good that people get high grades, and it is
Yeah.
good that people get high grades. But then at some point, you cannot differentiate between a 9 and a 10 anymore because you try to test for the 6 so that the people in the 6 range can show what they can do. But if everyone is getting 8s, 9s, and 10s, what's the difference between a 9 and a 10 then? Is that one extra mistake? Is it two extra mistakes? And how do you make sure that the people who would usually get a 6 would still get that 6? So that's very difficult for them to figure out. It's a big struggle actually at the moment.
So is that just with you, or is that with other teachers as well?
No, it's with other teachers as well. Yeah, it's a general impression that they have of the Dutch level of English.
Okay, so what else do you find challenging about being an English teacher?
Well, I think the fact that they have this high level of English, um, because we cannot test them at a very high level, and I don't want to do the grammar tests because then you don't really test something; you just test how well they know the grammar rules. So students get a bit lazy when it comes to English because they think, well, I can do this. Yeah, but I can do this. Even though I would say, well, okay, you are in that zone of proximal development, you are quite good, but I do still see that you make lots of mistakes when you're writing stuff. Yeah, but I'm just going to do that when the test comes and then I'll pass. So that's the biggest challenge, to motivate them to reach for higher progress and reach for more progress when they already feel that they are quite good.
Mhm.
I think that's the biggest challenge as an English teacher now in the Netherlands.
And is it necessary to speak English, be fluent in English in the Netherlands to, have like a good paying job, for example? Because I know sometimes, that may be the case in some countries.
I don't think it's necessary, but I do think for the jobs, I don't think it's necessary to have a good paying, well-paying job when you that you need to speak English. But I do think that if you want to study in the Netherlands, then speaking English is becoming more of a requirement because lots of our university programs are moving towards English, unfortunately. And then I noticed that students who don't have the level of English required to study in English, even though that they'll catch up at some point, they struggle a lot in the beginning because they're unfamiliar with English being taught everywhere. Studying in English, as in really studying the materials for to produce them on a test or whatever, that's different than studying English. So they struggle with that as well. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of in the Netherlands now. That students need to learn English to be able to study, not to be able to speak to British speakers.
So yeah,
Yeah.
that for me, that was always very surprising when I would meet, multilingual students when I was in college, even right now, because, just say in this university, everything is taught in English, but they're not a native English speaker, right? But they learned it, and now they're at a university learning, whatever the degree is in English. For me, that's mind blowing. Because for me, even at my level of Spanish, I can't imagine myself being in a, university that teaches only in Spanish. Like I'll be like, I feel like I'll fail.
Yeah,
That's a
yeah,
lot.
yeah. And maybe you know the language, but you're unable to produce that language on the test, for example, because you're not studying the language anymore. You're studying the materials. Yeah, and I think we do our best to make sure that the students get there. And the good thing is that some university degrees are still taught by Dutch teachers. So, if you struggle and the teacher struggles as well, then you can find some middle ground. But sometimes you get people from other countries who need to teach you the materials, and then it becomes difficult because then you might get someone from Africa with a large African accent, which is fine, of course. But then the Dutch people are familiar with American English, and then they have this African teacher teaching them in African English, and then they struggle because they aren't able to understand the person. They don't know what he's saying. His English is poor. Instead of having an open mindset and saying, okay, I need to work a bit harder for this. No, their English is poor. That's the problem. Instead of, no, that's their variety of English that they're speaking, which is fine. So that's a struggle, definitely, for students at the moment.
And which language skill would you say is the most difficult for students to acquire? Yeah, and I guess to increase. So in between reading, writing, listening, and speaking.
I'd say writing and speaking. Yeah, the productive skills are very difficult to acquire because they take a different approach. Well, speaking requires someone else to speak to, and writing requires feedback and thinking about what you're doing, and someone who points out your flaws in your writing, whether they are structural or they are language related, or you've been using the simple words all the time or incorrect words all the time. So I think writing and speaking, the productive skills, are the ones that are most challenging to increase and to improve.
Especially with the
Yeah.
writing. My writing in Spanish, I think, has been exactly the same for the past 4 years. Ever since I left university, it's been exactly the same. Because I mean, I write in Spanish and everything, but it's not like I am dedicating every single day to improving my writing skills. I mean, I would say indirectly because of exposure to Spanish. I like to read in Spanish, I like to listen to, music in Spanish and talk to Spanish speakers. But to really develop it, my writing skills to like the next level, I think would take a lot more dedication, a lot more hours.
Yeah. And you need someone who points out that you're using the words incorrectly or that you've been using simple words all the time. So, and someone who says, well, try to find a different word. So you need a Grammarly for Spanish, actually.
Yeah, we do. I need Grammarly for that.
And I think definitely that ChatGPT or any of the other AI bots can help you with it. That's for sure.
I'm starting to see a lot more language learners use Chat, GPT. I'm starting to see a lot more YouTube videos pop up about that as well. I haven't used it too much, but I mean, it seems pretty interesting.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on Chat GPT and language learning? And if it disrupts, traditional methods for language learning?
It definitely disrupts traditional methods. That's for sure. The same way the computer did when that was invented. I think that I've been to BET a few last week, so that's a UK event where they had lots of technology for education, and there were some very interesting language-related AI things that I thought, and games that I thought, well, these are very good ways to use AI, which are usually things like feedback, usually things like and the conversation adjusting based on the level of the learner. So I think AI will enhance the way that we teach language and at some point that we learn language. That's definitely for sure. But then we need to let go of the idea of AI creating stuff for us. So AI being our easy way out. And we need to see AI as a tool. That's why I like Grammarly, for example, because it always gives recommendations of different words that you can use if the engagement in your piece is a bit bland or it's boring or the tone is off, then it would give you different words that you can use. And that's what I really like about Grammarly. So if there's something Grammarly like for Spanish, it'll definitely improve your writing skills.
I mean, I'm sure online you could, probably copy and paste like a paragraph and it can make some corrections, but I don't know, how accurate it would be or if it would give you suggestions for like other things to say. So I should definitely look into that.
Yeah.
And so you also mentioned, I think was it Finland and their level of English. So what's that whole deal there?
Well, in Europe, the idea that the Finnish education system is the best is the thing that's been ruling our hallways for quite some time. People talk about redesigning education, which is also something that's happening in the US, actually, where US high schools are also rethinking the way that they teach. And for some reason, people always look at Finland to say the Finnish and the Danish are the best when it comes to teaching and understanding education. I don't really agree, not because that they're not good or anything, but I think it really relates to culture that you grow up in. If you look at Asian countries, for example, where it's still very much that parents have the final say in things, whereas we don't really have that. So we can't compare ourselves to Asian countries or even the Finnish, because we have a different culture and we look at hierarchy differently than that they do. Even though that there might be interesting things that we need to look at when it comes to Finland and Asian countries, I don't think that we can basically copy and paste what they're doing there and do it here and say, oh, it will work, because it probably won't.
So is the culture in Finland that different from Dutch culture? Because I have no idea.
I don't know. I don't know the details though, but what I've
Mhm.
heard from what I've seen and from why those education systems work is that um, one thing is that children go to school in Finland very late. So I think they start going to school around 9-ish, as
Wow.
in, or 8, 9-ish. So it's rather late when compared to us, where we go to school at 6 or 4.
Hmm.
So
Wow.
children get more time to play around, more time to experiment and to engage outside, for example, than in our country. And I think that in those countries, like Finland, they have a more holistic approach to teaching, where the parents and the teachers and the educators are all on the same page. Whereas here, I feel that sometimes we have a battle between parents and teachers, which I don't think that we should be having, because then that's not the right way to teach. I think you really need to be on the same page when it comes to teaching and raising a kid. And I think that's the biggest difference. Now, some people say that parents always undermine teachers. I haven't experienced it yet,
It's
but
good.
yeah, but I think some parents do think that school is not that important. Also, depending on where you're from in our country, and there are areas where school is not considered that important, especially
Hmm.
farmer areas where children will end up in the farm anyway. So why would you go to a university? It doesn't even come up to those parents to send their children to university because they didn't go to university.
Yeah. For me, that's wow, that's so strange to wait until like, you're 9, to go to school. For me, I actually never even heard of that before because, we go to school, I would say like around, 4 or 5 as well. Or I guess we
I don't
have
know
kinder care.
exactly. I don't know whether the nine is age 9 is actually factually true, but I remember reading a book a few days ago in which
Hmm.
they talked about playing outside, and that the Finnish were relatively late when it comes to sending children to school.
That's still pretty interesting. Yeah, I wonder how that would change the development of a child, one that goes to school starting at, 3, 4 years old versus one that starts at 9 or 10.
I think that what the person in the book said is that children are more adventurous when they go to school a little late, because especially boys get more the chance to play around because boys need to play. So, and then
Yes.
we put them in these chairs and behind these desks in a row in a room, and then they need to sit down and listen for 50 minutes and then 8 hours a day. So yeah, they found that children are able to play more, and they found, and that's particularly interesting, that these children have less instances of ADHD. So, because the children
Wow.
are able to play around more, they tend to be less prone to ADHD. Yeah, and they can focus more, and they can, um, they just sit when they have when they have to sit down. Whereas what we do is we put them in school when they're 4, and they play around a lot when they're 4 or 5. But then when they reach like what we call grade 3, they start learning words and sentences and reading and stuff, and then stuff becomes more serious, and they need to sit for 6 hours a day and listen to the teacher. So yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. I mean, I think a lot of students have that, that similar experience where they're like, oh God, I hate sitting here, trying to learn. I can't wait. I'm, staring at the clock. I'm ready to leave. I don't want to learn anything
Yeah.
else.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that those are things that we need to think about. How can we redesign our education? And I really believe that in the Netherlands, a subject like English, something that students learn a lot outside of school, can be the subject that we change, that we start redesigning. I usually tell my colleagues I'm not that particularly necessary, right? They would survive in English if I wasn't here. So because they learn so much English outside of school, that when it comes to the language on its own, they don't really need me. That's also challenging for me because what do I need to do when I when I have to teach them, right? What am I going to teach them?
Mhm.
Um, but I do think that English is the subject that gives us the space to redesign what we're doing when compared to, for example, maths or history, which are really subjects that have their own material and curriculum. And you don't learn that much about maths or history outside of school, but you do that with English.
Okay, so this is kind of a random question, but right now, English is very popular around the world. English is being taught, everywhere. Do you see another language, popping up and being, like how English is right now, being the most taught and being the most popular?
No, I don't think so. I don't
Wow.
think that there will be a language that will dethrone English. I think in Europe we will see a surge of interest in Spanish. I think, especially in the Netherlands, where people are forced to learn French and forced to learn German, and we're seeing that less and less students are learning French now because it's forced. We see also an increase of students learning Spanish. So in the Netherlands on its own, we definitely see the surge of interest in Spanish. But I don't think that English will be dethroned anytime soon. No, what do you think?
In my opinion, I don't know. I can't really say. I can only talk about, in the United States specifically. And it seems like Spanish could dethrone English because
In the
we
United
speak.
States?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, especially for me, like I live in Texas right now, and like here it's Spanglish everywhere already. So it's already like a huge mixture of, Spanish and English. There's even more Spanish speakers that are moving to the US from, all across Latin America. So I feel like the culture has been changing a decent amount. And even just, some of the Americans here, that aren't Latino, they're getting more influenced by Latino culture as well because they're more around Latinos, or Hispanics in general. So they're starting to listen to more of their music. Bad Bunny, he's been very huge. So a lot of us are listening to Bad Bunny now, listen to reggaeton. So I see like a big shift in that, and just in general, we have a lot more, I would say, Spanish immersion schools here as well. So now finally, I was probably not finally, I don't know if it was happened beforehand, but it seems like there definitely is a lot more focus on, multiculturalism, and then also, growing up bilingual, which I think is, really great. I think it's a really good skill to have if you can
Yeah.
speak multiple languages.
Do you think now this is a challenging question, so you can leave this one out? But do you think with Trump being president and he might become president again, that will influence that negatively?
I don't think so at all, actually. I
Okay.
really don't. Because I think people, for example, just the past, well, I guess, 6 years, or no, longer than that, when he first, I guess 2016, when he first came into office, a lot of people were pushing back against his narratives. So even though the majority, like of the Americans here, they would kind of fight back against that rhetoric and that kind of mentality, like, oh, we only speak English here, that kind of thing, so I don't know all of his rhetoric or whatnot, but I'm just, that's just kind of what my impression is. I think we were definitely getting away from that. And just because like a president is saying we only speak English here, it's like, no, that's not the case. I mean, you can go to so many places. Like even right now in San Antonio where I live, I can go to many different stores, many different shops, and only speak Spanish. I don't have to speak English at all. Just Spanish because it's of the quantity of Spanish speakers that are here, the quantity
Wow.
of Spanish businesses that are here as well.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about the UK of the US and Europe just now when you were saying about Spanish being the language to dethrone English. I think in Europe it's different because we're simply smaller. We
Mhm.
have way more of those small countries that can't survive on their own. So the Netherlands is, nobody speaks Dutch other than our former colonies. So we need a different language to be able to communicate to others.
Okay.
And we used to be the people that spoke a lot of languages because we used to learn a lot of languages, but now we just rely on English. So I think because we need this shared lingua franca, English cannot really be dethroned now, especially now since Brexit, when the UK left the European Union. English is still the language of the European Union. So, we've unlinked, if you like, English from England and use it as our lingua franca. And I think in the US it's different because you're so big and everybody already speaks English. You don't really look at it the same way. I don't know. That was something that I was thinking of.
Yeah, I guess because the culture here is very different in
Yeah.
education and everything. So, and it's very big.
Yeah.
And it can vary state to state as well. So,
Yeah.
but I guess like to add on to that, even you can find products here now that have like English and then Spanish and French translation. So you see that a lot more on products. If you go to the ATM, I can choose it between English and Spanish. Same thing if I call into, a particular, company or whatnot, there's, one for English or para español, marca número dos.
Yeah, we have that with Dutch and English. And we even had, when during the pandemic, our government even printed information regarding vaccines and, just general health in English, Polish, Ukrainian, Turkish, Moroccan. Lots of minority languages in the Netherlands were represented in those materials regarding vaccinations and how to stay healthy during the pandemic, because they were aware of the fact that we had so many different minorities.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, let's touch on that a little bit more in the Netherlands. So are there, like here, there are different communities, right? Let's say like there's like a Somali community, there's like a, like a Mexican community, Nigerian community like that. And, they're able to like, still speak their language, like have their businesses and stuff like that, in their language. Do they have those types of communities there in the Netherlands as well? They have that type of culture?
I think so, but it's more mixed. So you might have a community with people from Turkey and Morocco. You might have an Eastern European community with people from lots of different Eastern European countries. And there are parts of the Netherlands where they've never seen anyone from a different country at all. We now have a refugee crisis as well, because for some weird reason, lots of refugees end up in the Netherlands. And we have a system that kind of checks for every refugee individually whether they're allowed to come in or they have to go back. And now we have this clog of refugees at the entrance point, which is really just a very small town near where I live, at Ter Apel. And that's the first place where people come in as refugees. That's a refugee camp where they would then be sent to different locations throughout the country. So now we have lots of African people in that area of the Netherlands and people from Syria. So yeah, that might be a community on its own as well. But then we have this thing called inburgering, which is where people kind of, how would you describe inburgeren? People would kind of get familiar with the Dutch culture. They have to do a course on Dutchisms. When do you put the bin out? Those things. They need to learn the language, which especially older people don't really do. But they have to learn the language to become Dutch citizens or be allowed access into the country for a longer time.
So how long? Okay, so you said for access into the country for a longer time. So is that for anybody or just specifically for refugees?
I think it's for everybody. Everybody who wants to work in the Netherlands needs to do this course, and then they would receive a permit to work and stay in the Netherlands and start a family, for example. Yeah, get a driver's license.
And I can tell that you're very passionate about language learning, and you have a lot of education, a lot of passion. And I just kind of want to know, where did that all come from specifically? Like and I guess, your passion for, teaching English, your desire to teach English. Where did it all start?
I don't know. I think when I was young, I always played with the stuffed animals that I was the teacher. I played school with stuffed animals. And then I moved on to learning English and studying applied linguistics. And I just like making stuff. So I like making teaching materials. So I also like to use those in class, especially when I think, okay, it looks nice, like as in it's well designed. I would use that as well. So I don't really know why I ended up studying linguistics. But when I was in my third year of secondary school, I thought, what shall I be when I grow up? And I thought, well, I want to be a teacher. I wanted to be a primary school teacher, but then I noticed how little those people make. So I decided, well, let's do a university program and become an English teacher at secondary schools. And then I came into contact with applied linguistics because I thought everything was about literature and I didn't like reading that much. So when I found out that I could do applied linguistics, I did lots of linguistics courses and applied linguistics as my master's. And yeah, that's basically how it went.
Did you find studying linguistics very difficult?
Not really, actually. I found phonetics quite difficult, and the sentence trees were challenging, but it was fun because it was very technical. So I really like that.
Okay, so what made you want to start a YouTube channel and teach even more students?
Well, during the pandemic, I thought I need to make sure that I have materials ready for when another lockdown hits. And that's when I started creating YouTube videos. And I was following Peter McKinnon. I don't know if you know Peter McKinnon on YouTube.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
But I liked his video. So I thought, well, why don't I do that, but then for English? I did that for 2 videos and noticed it's a bit more work than I thought, but especially with how the algorithm works and that you need 8 minutes and that you need to have some sort of the first 30 seconds are the most important ones, blah, blah, blah. So then I stopped making those kinds of videos and really focused on how can I do this, give as much information as possible in as little time as possible, unless it requires more time. So yeah, the pandemic really set off my YouTube channel, right? And that was when I thought, well, this is something fun to do. This is interesting.
So how do you balance now language learning, teaching English, creating all these materials and, correcting, I guess, all these homework assignments or, grading examinations and, life? How do you balance all that? It seems like you're very busy all the time.
It's challenging. It's challenging. It's challenging. Yeah, I worked full time last year and I realized I don't want to do it anymore. And I'm still finding my way actually between working and my hobbies, my running, and doing the videos, and having a girlfriend and doing stuff with her as well. So I won't say I'm not able to say that I've grasped a system that works at the moment.
One final question before we close out here. So, what is your opinion on this idea of becoming fluent in a language in 30 days or like a month or 3 months, 6 months?
Well, it depends. If you're doing full immersion, I think you can get quite far. But there are not that many people who do full immersion. So I don't really believe in getting fluent in 30 days or learn a language in 30 days. Maybe you can do lots of basics in 30 days. I think you can do a lot in 30 days, in 6 months, in a year. But language learning is dynamic and language changes over time as well. And to be able to really, really become fluent, you need to spend a lot of time on the language. So I don't think that those 30 days things are really valid and reliable. I think they can teach you lots of the basics. But there's, especially in things like adjectives and adverbs, the things that make the language beautiful, they need to be encountered naturally. And you can't do that in 30 days, I think.
Good points. Good points. So how can all the language learners that are watching or that will be watching this video learn more about you and, get in contact with you?
Well, definitely check my YouTube channel out, English with Mr. Henriquez, if you want to learn English, but also if you're interested in language learning as a more general stance, because I sometimes post on language learning videos, which are on language learning. If you like to read stuff that I write, check out my Medium. On Medium, I share lots of articles. Some are paid. The ones that I really do research for, dive into research papers, those are paid and require a subscription. But the basic ones about how to learn a language and reviews and stuff are free. And of course, check out Instagram and TikTok for Synonym Sunday and lots of other fun short materials that you might enjoy while learning a language.
Excellent. And those are all under the same name too?
Yeah. English with Mr. Henriquez.
Okay.
or Mr. Henriquez.
Thank you very much for having this conversation and sharing your experience.
De nada.
Wow. Absolutely amazing. It's been a very fun conversation.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.